Welcome back to Investing Talk podcast. We're going to be focusing on Dynex Capital today.
Right.
You shared some information about Dynex Capital, and we're hoping to kind of unpack what's most important for people to know about them right now.
Yep.
We've got information spanning their company overview, recent stock performance, what's driving that price, financial health indicators, potential red flags, strengths, competitive position, future outlook, and even some technical analysis observations.
Sounds good.
It's quite a bit.
Yeah.
So let's start with, I guess, like a basic understanding of what Dynex Capital does.
Sure. So Dynex Capital is a publicly traded REIT. It specializes in mortgage-backed securities.
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is they invest in both residential and commercial mortgage-backed securities. Their goal is to provide consistent dividends, long-term returns to shareholders. They're a link between capital markets and the housing finance sector.
So they're not like directly involved in like the construction or property management side of real estate?
No, they're not. They're solely focused on the investment side of things,
Gotcha. Okay.
specifically within these mortgage-backed securities. As of December 31st, 2024, their market cap was $1.1 billion. Their portfolio fair value was $9.8 billion.
Wow.
And they've had a total stock return of 436% since their IPO.
Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive.
Yes, that's a remarkable long-term performance.
Yeah. So what about their recent stock price movement?
So the recent stock price was around $13.71. There was a slight decrease recently, 0.58%.
Okay.
But it's important to note that their stock performance is generally tied to the real estate and financial markets. So any major shifts there will likely be reflected in their stock value.
Makes sense. So what are some of the main factors driving that stock price fluctuation?
Well, the sources point to several key drivers. First, interest rates and monetary policy. Changes in interest rates have a significant impact on mortgage-backed securities, which of course is Dynex's core investment area.
Right.
Higher rates can decrease demand for MBSs. Second, overall economic conditions. So, things like inflation, employment levels, those influence the real estate market, and that affects Dynex's investments as well.
Right.
And finally, the regulatory environment, changes in financial regulations affecting REITs. Those can also play a role.
So it's not just like what's happening within the company, it's kind of like the bigger economic picture that really influences their stock price.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about their financial health? What are some of the key things we should be looking at there?
Okay. So for Dynex, their revenue mainly comes from interest income on their MBS holdings.
Okay.
Net income is influenced by the difference between the yield on their MBSs and then their financing costs.
Okay.
Now, as a mortgage REIT, it's important to note that they likely use leverage. So debt levels are something to consider as well.
Yeah, makes sense. So are there any like red flags that stick out when we're looking at Dynex Capital? And also, are there any particular strengths that really stand out?
Yeah, so there is a notable red flag, and that's their sensitivity to interest rate changes. We talked about how rising rates can decrease profitability.
Right.
And then the use of leverage, that's another concern. While leverage can boost returns, it can also amplify losses in a downturn.
Yeah, double-edged sword.
Exactly. But on the strength side, they offer consistent dividend payments.
Okay.
And they actually have a high annualized dividend yield, like 14.2%.
Wow, that's pretty substantial.
That's very attractive
Sure.
for investors seeking income. And they also have, expertise in managing these MBS portfolios.
Right. Okay, so that kind of leads into my next question. How does Dynex Capital stack up against its competitors?
So Dynex competes with other mortgage REITs. You've got companies like Annaly Capital Management, AG&C Investment Corp.
Okay.
Key competitive factors include market share, innovation. Dynex actually emphasizes disciplined capital allocation as part of their strategy.
Okay.
And of course, you've got financial metrics like dividend yields and leverage.
Yeah.
Now, when you compare them to someone like Annaly, they have a smaller market share.
Okay.
Annaly has a larger portfolio and a lot of experience in residential housing finance.
Gotcha. So it seems like they're all kind of operating in the same space, but they're each kind of like finding their own niche within that.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about their future outlook? What are some things that could positively or negatively impact them moving forward?
Well, potential positive catalysts include things like positive earnings reports.
Sure.
That would boost investor confidence and maybe increase the stock price. Also, a decrease in interest rates would be beneficial as it could drive up demand for mortgage-backed securities.
Right.
On the negative side, you've got regulatory changes in the housing finance sector. Those could present challenges. And then any kind of negative economic conditions, like a recession or if interest rates continue to rise, those could also have a negative impact.
So a lot of it really comes back to kind of like what's happening in the larger economy.
Okay. So we've covered their business model. We've talked about recent performance, factors influencing their stock price, financial health, strengths, weaknesses, competitive position. Let's dive into the technical analysis a little bit.
All right.
What are some of the key takeaways there?
So the recent trading price was around $13.71. We talked about that.
Right.
The 52-week high was $13.85. Recent lows, $13.69.
Okay.
Moderate trading volume, around 2,816,617 shares.
Gotcha.
Now, when you look at the moving averages, both the 50-day and the 200-day, those can help us understand the short-term and long-term trends. If the stock price is consistently above its 200-day moving average, it suggests a positive long-term trend.
Okay.
Another indicator to watch is the Relative Strength Index, the RSI.
Okay.
If it's below 30, it might mean the stock is oversold. That could be a buying opportunity. But if it's above 70, it might be overbought. Could be time to sell or take some profits.
Interesting.
Now, we don't have those specific values for the moving averages in the RSI right now, so it's best to be cautious. But generally speaking, if the stock is above its 200-day moving average and the RSI isn't too high, it might be a good idea to hold or even consider buying if the price dips a bit.
Okay. So taking all this into account, it seems like Dynex Capital has a lot to offer. It's got a high dividend yield, a history of strong returns, but of course, their performance is really tied to interest rates and the overall economic climate.
Exactly.
And, the technical analysis gives us some additional things to watch.
It does. It really kind of boils down to this. How does Dynex Capital fit into your overall investment strategy? Considering the strengths and the potential risks tied to the market, it's about finding that balance.
Yeah, finding that risk-reward balance.
Absolutely.
Well, I think this has been a really valuable deep dive into Dynex Capital. And for our listeners out there, we encourage you to subscribe, like, and leave us a comment.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time.
Sounds good.